The presentation is titled Science, Technology and Recycling in State-socialist Hungary. It is something that has been briefly published in Discourse Studies last year. The title of that article was Waste and Recycling in Cold War Eastern Europe, the case of the BE Waste Collection Trust in Hungary. And I think it was a fairly successful publication. There has been some references that has been mentioning this publication, and it was also copied by another media outlet a few months later on. So I think this was a good start. And the next phase is going to be an article that has been formally and after revisions accepted at the Environmental History Journal, that is probably the leading journal on the field of environmental history, and will be appearing next year in the second issue, titled like Busy Bees, Paper, Waste and Recycling in Communist Hungary in 1950 and 1990. So this presentation is very heavily based on those works and quasi-summarizing the main ideas or some of the ideas behind those papers. And the question emerges, like, why it is interesting to deal with waste and recycling in socialism. I think some of these elements have been already mentioned in the previous presentations, that the Soviet bloc has been often interpreted as a dirty and wasteful place compared to the clean and superior West. And this interpretation has been losing from its popularity, as it was the dominant perception in the 1980s and 1990s, but nevertheless, it is still part of the consensus, as it's very often, the claim has been very often repeated by leading scientists in works that are touching on larger topics. What I try to do in these papers is to look at and focus at recycling from the perspective of circular versus open systems, and what is suggested in the literature that circular economies that were somehow and somewhat circular have existed in the past, especially before the 20th century, and it was the United States that moved away from this organization of the economy, where more circular practices existed than they exist today. So the question emerges how the circulation of materials, waste and discards production played out in the communist countries, because they had a different economic organization, political ideologies, and then consequently perceptions when it comes to human nature relationships. What happened there? How in what ways the organization of recycling was similar or different than in other states with different political and economic organizations? So I think this is an image that is very much and very successfully reflecting the overall perception of Eastern Europe, an area, topographical, political, economic area after the Second World War, that was where the development of heavy industries dominated the landscape, especially the iron and steel industries that were closely associated with Stalinism and goals of Stalinism of heavy industrial planning, as it has been already pointed out in the previous presentations. And another side of socialist development, especially after the opening up of the 1960s and the development of consumerism or consumer culture, was the increased waste production. So this is an image that we perhaps see less frequently, as our understanding has been most or often based on heavy industrial pollution. But the importance of post-consumer waste couldn't be underestimated in post-Second World War Eastern Europe, especially as we move closer towards the 1970s and 1980s, when more and more opportunities open up for consumerism and subsequently for post-consumer waste production and the boom of that post-consumer waste production. However, from an ideological perspective, waste should be framed rather as secondary materials in the Soviet bloc, because the major goal in a socialist economy is to produce as little byproducts and waste materials as possible, and to recycle as many materials as it is possible. And there has been a very exciting discussion about industrial symbiosis systems on an industrial level, as well as circular measures and the establishment of zero waste systems, both for residential areas and also for industrial areas. So the discussion, the theoretical discussion, is rather different from the grim realities or the grim perception of mostly Western-led scholarly debate. But what happened in reality? That is perhaps a third and very interesting question. How these grand theories of zero waste and no waste and total recycling and total planning, ideas that have been touched upon by in this panel already, were realized in the Hungarian case. Well, we see that the post-consumer waste and post-industrial waste have been recycled from a very early point. All sorts of materials: bones, cardboards, fats, feathers, glasses, textiles, metals, papers, and a long list of other materials. Generally, these secondary materials or waste materials that were composed of quasi-traditional materials that had already a tradition of recycling before the communist period, not just in Eastern Europe, but all over the world, such as bones and paper and animal byproducts and metals. It was fairly and often quasi-simple to set up recycling measures for these materials. As you can see on this image, collecting waste, metals, iron, copper, and other types of metals have been one of the priorities of the communist systems in Eastern Europe, starting from day one. Most importantly, because they fueled the emerging heavy industries. And this is very much also connected with the Soviet model, where metallic recycling and paper recycling both were the backbones of the recycling system. Although there has been theories that paper recycling was not per se about paper production, but it was also to confiscate and seize material, printed material that was circulated and published before the Bolshevik Revolution. In this way, we can also associate paper recycling with those ideological aspects. However, the implementation of the central recycling system was rather different from the Soviet model. So in the 1930s, Soyuz Util was set up by the Ministry of Light Industries, and it was responsible for collecting the secondary materials in the Soviet Union, whereas in Hungary, the centralization was not unfolding without obstacles. The Ministry of Heavy Industry stepped on to the recycling activities very efficiently to collect its primary metallic waste. However, the company that was set up did not own infrastructure for small-scale recycling. And this is where the ideological debate began, because the Minister of Light Industry and some of the planning experts proposed that post-consumer waste, for example, metal waste, should be also collected with larger efficiency. And so if the Ministry of Heavy Industries own pet companies responsible for the recycling activities, then the danger emerges that a large amount of materials coming from the post-consumer cycle would not be able to collected and transported for recycling plants. And an exciting debate started. It went up all the way to the National Assembly, where some of the proponents who wanted to reform the system, and this is a peculiar perk in it, proposed that the Soviet Stalinist model should be implemented instead of the decentralized character of the Hungarian recycling system in the early 1950s. So for the reformists, it seemed that the Hungarian system was too liberal in that sense and too little centralized. And consequently, by the 1950s and 1970s, there is a centralization theme that is unfolding within the recycling industry. And the Ministry of Light Industries' own pet firm became victorious in that discourse and power struggle. And this company, the B company, was able to establish nationwide recycling chain of waste sorting plants. Yes. What is worth to note, I think, that with traditional materials, yes, there were a number of challenges to recycle them. They required heavy manpower, or better to say human power, to collect them, sort them into appropriate packages, as you can see on this image, that could be transported for recycling. But let's say this is more of a kind of easier technological problem. And as you see, this recycling collection point of the B company is located in a highly urbanized setting, probably somewhere in downtown Budapest. And so it is specialized on post-consumer waste, which is representing another problem, how post-consumer waste can be transported easily, with ease, without major efforts to these recycling locations or points where the industry can collect them with efficiency. So there is a number of technological issues represented in the process, and this is especially visible when it comes to more complex products, not just paper, but for example, car parts that can be often dangerous and harmful for the environment as well, or very difficult to recycle. So as you can see, this quasi-abandoned recycling location where trucks are waiting for to be recycled, and you see an engine in the foreground that is already leaking engine oil and potentially harmful substances. This is raising the question of environmental safety and environmental protection as well. And as we walk ahead in time, there is more and more complex products entering the waste stream. In the 1960s sees a mass boom of not just car tires, but plastic products or plastic-based products in general. And the classical paper wrapping also becomes a mixture of plastic film and paper, and that poses significant challenges for the recycling industry, because what they realized that all those Soviet ideals, all those communist ideals that are driving the process to have a more efficient recycling industry, they are very difficult to implement on ground. They are extremely difficult to maintain because of the financial and technological burdens they pose on the socialist economy. You need machinery, you need funding, you often need foreign technology. And this is why sometimes some of the collected waste that could be collected fairly cheaply and somewhat efficiently with the traditional channels of the big company or other state-owned firms employing domestic workforce within Hungary, they were collected, such as these tires, and with growing frequency by the 1980s. This kind of waste, for example, tires, that's a typical example, were exported as raw material for Western countries on the other side of the Iron Curtain, for example, to Austria, where they could be recycled because the technological preconditions were present for that quasi-complex and high input recycling works. The Hungarians struggled to recycle these materials, but they represented a source of income and an opportunity to get rid of them by exporting them, which is a very interesting perk in the export of waste, especially when we think about current tendencies, when many of the raw materials are extracted somewhere in the global south, being used as consumer products in the global north, and then transported back to the global south to the waste dumps. For example, electronic waste has been one of the most notably discussed material that has been flowing in those terms in the past decades. And yes, so electronic waste is another very complex issue that is presenting a growing concern, especially with the widespread use of electronic goods and household appliances, starting from the 1970s and 1980s. So we have this image, right, that the socialist system worked in quasi-efficiency when it comes to recycling, and in many cases it did. For example, when we think of simple materials or beverage containers, and simple materials such as newspapers, the system indeed worked, and propaganda was a big part of it. But when it comes to a more complex ways or more complex challenges of recycling complex materials, disassembling them and recycling them, then the challenge becomes more difficult. But make no mistake, it was not different in the West, as we know that much of plastic, sorted plastic post-consumer waste is being incinerated in most of the global north. So the recycling challenges are still there, and they're not different from the past. And in many cases, the recycling cannot be carried out because of the enormous technological challenges and non-profitability of the sector. And this is what becomes the recycling in state-socialist Hungary as well in the 1980s. Ironically, you can see this bicycle and school children escorting this hoarded large amount of newspaper, pile of newspapers to be recycled, and then some of them are in a plastic bag hanging from the bicycle, and the text says BASF. So it's a Western chemical company's plastic bag that is used for the recycling of paper in the early 1980s in Hungary. And yes, so the efficiency of the recycling was aimed at to be increased in the 1960s and 70s, but with the growing difficulty of more complex materials, it was harder and harder to make a change and stop the ever-widening flow of discards in state-socialist Hungary. And by the 1980s, the documents suggest a sort of acknowledgement of failure and a turning point in the sense of utilization of propaganda. That is the time, and this is very much highlighted in the article that the articles that I mentioned. That is the time when the economic technological system is not working very visibly. It's so visible, it's visible for the much of the adult population. So instead of fully acknowledging that, the government and it's the state administration orchestrates conjointly with experts and non-political organizations, widespread recycling campaigns to raise awareness of the importance of recycling, especially among children. And that is a very interesting tendency, how adult recycling, post-consumer recycling, and how industrial recycling has come to quasi-dead end, and how this new opportunity of using children and their environmental education as a quasi-excuse or an underlying propaganda feature to try to improve the recycling efficiency in state-socialist Hungary.